English button.
Good evening and welcome you all to the Chiaw Zonal English channel. We are ready to start our second day online workshop for GZ A-Level students English 73. It's a great pleasure to see you all on online platform. I must express my sincere gratitude to our resource persons, Mrs. Ginelli Fernando, the Senior Lecturer of University of California, and Mrs. Vaidehi Pereira for accepting our invitation and devoting their much valued time with us to educate the students of GZ A-Level who are offering English as a subject. Let me introduce our two speakers today. Mrs. Dinelli Fernando, Senior Lecturer of University of California. She possesses an honors degree in University of California, and she is excelling in the field with lots of research work and lots of studies in field of English. We are much privileged to have Madam Dinelli with us today. And also our second resource person, Mrs. Vaidehi Pereira. She has an honors degree in English from University of California. She has over 25 years of experience in teaching A-level English literature. Presently, she teaches at St. Thomas's College, Mount Lavinia. She also has taught in Ladies College and Methodist College, Colombo. Many of her students have got A passes in A-level English, and some have gone to the excel in their studies, both in Sri Lanka and abroad. So we are much privileged to have both Mrs. Dinelli Fernando, the Senior Lecturer of University, and Mrs. Vaidehi Pereira, well-experienced English literature teacher for the second day. Thank you very much. And Madam Dinelli and Mrs. Vaidehi, over to you to conduct the session.
Thank you, Mithila. Good evening, everybody. Nice to see a big crowd today as well. I'm not going to be a speaker today. I'm here to assist Ms. Vaidehi with the question and answer session, if at all. The session today, as Ms. Rasika said, it's on writing context questions, and it will be conducted by Ms. Vaidehi Pereira. So Vaidehi, let me hand over to you.
Hi, Dinelli, how do I get the video working here? There we go.
Perfect. Yeah, I think it.
Okay. Okay, children. Thank you, Rasika, for those really kind words.
Thank you very much.
And children, good evening. I am going to do the context questions with you. Now, this is a section of the A-level paper, the first paper, that is actually the easier section of the paper, because you follow a kind of a template or a pattern every time you answer a context. And after a while, I'm going to give you a checklist. And after a while, that checklist just stays in your head, and all you need to do is to follow it. The time you have for a context answer is limited. You have to aim to do it in 15 minutes so that you have 30 minutes for each of your long questions, which carry more than twice the marks of a context question, right? We all know that this English paper is crazily hard in terms of time management, right? So one of the things you need to learn to do is to time your answers and do a context in 15 minutes flat. Okay, if you spend more time than that, then you're going to be in trouble with your long answers. Okay, so I prepared what you call a slide presentation. I'm not so good with tech, so I'm apologizing ahead of time in case there are any glitches. Okay, let's see how this goes. Okay, there we go. So, answering context questions, let's first look at what the purpose is. Why is it that we have context questions to begin with, right? Other than just to test you, just to see whether you know your text thoroughly, whether to bring one random verse from a poem just to see whether you've covered your syllabus, okay? Let's look at what the purpose of a context question is. A context question makes you look at a very small portion of the text, right? But what is important is that while you look at that little portion, you're also keeping the rest of the text in mind. And the main question you ask yourself when you're doing a context question is, how are these lines significant in terms of the rest of the text? Okay, now we're going to work our way through context questions for drama, for short stories, and for poetry. I'm not doing the novel because the short story and the novel, you do the context question, you do your context answer in more or less the same way. Okay. So first and foremost, how is a context question graded by your examiner? Right? You get 1 mark for placing the context, right? And in my later slides, I will show you just how much is involved in just placing that context. You get 3 marks for content, right? You get 3 marks for content, which is somebody's mic is not muted.
Can everyone mute your mics, please? Let me. Okay, Vi, go ahead. Sorry about that.
Dinali, can you hear me?
Yes, go on, Vi.
1 mark for identifying the literary devices, and I will show you how to incorporate this into your answer. And then those 3 marks, children, for the way you write. Okay. And if your grammar is good, if your vocabulary is good, if your spelling is good, right, then you have an advantage because those 3 marks, or at least 2.5 of those marks, are yours. Okay, and it's a total of 8 marks. So the context count for 32% of your grade, as you know, right? Oops, sorry. Right. Okay, now what do you include in your answer? Let's do the drama and the short story first. Obviously, now everything I marked in red is for that 1 mark. Okay, so text, author, era. So say you're doing Othello, right? Remember that by the time Shakespeare wrote Othello, Queen Elizabeth was dead. So it's Jacobean type of work. It's a tragedy. Okay. Then, especially if it's a play, there's obviously a speaker and somebody who's being spoken to. So you have to mention that as well. Then, of course, you need to place the passage as accurately as possible. And this doesn't mean, children, that you narrate the whole story up to that point, right? You have to, just in a line or two, okay, in one sentence, right? That would be great. Place this passage, right? We'll be doing an Othello context a little later, and I will show you how to do that, right? Then the next 3 marks are marked in blue, right? You get, and that's the content portion of your mark. For character, discussing plot, discussing theme, okay? And what I marked in literary devices is that 1 mark that you get, and I will show you, as I said before, how to incorporate the literary devices into your main answer. Right, now poetry is a little different because you obviously don't have plot, you don't have characters, etc. Okay, so again, it's the poem, the poet, the era, right? And the type of poem. Is it an ode? Is it an elegy? If it is a sonnet, what kind of a sonnet is it, right? Also, the poet's background, if appropriate. Now remember, children, that this is not always the case. But say you get a context question from, Suicide in the Trenches, right? The fact that Siegfried Sassoon actually fought in the First World War, he survived the First World War, and that he's writing from a very, very personal experience of the war becomes absolutely essential to your understanding of the poem. Right? Sometimes you need a brief background to the poem. Like, say, for instance, if you have a context question from Rape of the Lock. Okay. Now, Rape of the Lock, as you know, is based on a real life incident, right? Arabella Fermor and Lord Petrie and the feud that was going on between the 2 families. So when you do a context from Rape of the Lock, you need to include very briefly that information, okay? And of course, then there are things like subject, theme, tone, atmosphere, okay? Because remember that for poetry, you will have far more literary devices than you will have for the short story. Okay, Shakespeare, yes, there might be as many literary devices. And of course, for poetry, sound effects, right? So is there alliteration? Is there assonance? What's the rhyme like? Okay, all those things you need to look at. Okay. Children, I think I just left out a couple of things. I'm sorry. Let me go back to the drama and short story slide, right? Because I don't think I explained the content clearly enough. If you look at character, what you need to look at is what do these lines show you about the character who is speaking? Okay. Also, sometimes it shows you something about the character who is being spoken to. And when we're talking about character, it's not just his character traits, right? It's also what he or she is feeling at that time, right? So let me give you an example. Say I'll just take a line from Othello at random. Yes. Remember when Othello says she had the act of shame committed 1,000 times. Okay. What does that show you about Othello? It shows you that at that time he's deeply disturbed, distressed, right? And hugely jealous. Okay. The way you combine the literary device when you're talking about character, right, is to say, right, the act of shame 1,000 times committed, right? Human beings are not capable of that. Nobody has that stamina. So it's obviously a hyperbole. So you include that when you're talking about character. So you say he's obviously very jealous, he's distressed, and that Shakespeare communicates this by using a hyperbole. In that way, you're not leaving your literary devices to the very end, but you are including them when you're talking about character, when you're talking about theme, whatever. Plot, children, requires you to look forward. It requires you to look backwards, right? Not often both together, but let me take an example from Nectar in a Sieve. Okay, you remember that bit when Kunti blackmails Rukmani into giving her the rice that she has carefully portioned out, right? She knows that they're going to have several days before the next harvest and they're going to starve. So she carefully portions out the rice. And Kunti comes and blackmails her and takes the rice, right? Now, how is this relevant to the plot? If you look just a little forward, you will find that Kunti also blackmails Nadan, so they are left with absolutely no rice at all. But it has a further impact because it leads to Hira prostituting herself and it leads to the death of Rukmani's littlest, right, Kutti. Okay, so that's how you link it to the plot. That's how you link your passage to the plot. Now, theme, children, you don't need to look for all the themes in the what do you call it, in the work. Look at the lines. What themes of the play or the short story or the novel can you find in those lines? That's all you need to focus on. Okay, so let's look at this passage. How poor are they that have no patience? What wound did ever heal but by degrees? Thou knowest we work by wit and not by witchcraft, and wit depends on dilatory time. Does it not go well? Cassio had beaten thee, and thou by that small hurt had cashiered Cassio. Though other things grow fair against the sun, yet fruits that blossom first will first be ripe. Content thyself a while. By the mast is morning. Pleasure and action make the hours seem short. Okay, so this is obviously from Othello. This is when now, this is where placing it accurately comes in. Because where do these lines appear? When Rodrigo, who's been beaten up by Cassio thanks to Iago's plan, comes back and tells Iago that he has no money left, that he has been beaten badly, and that he's going back to Venice. Okay, and this is Iago's attempt to keep him in Venice, to keep him in Cyprus because he needs to use him further. Okay. So, what does the passage show us about Iago? Right? It shows us with what conviction he speaks. It shows us how manipulative he is. Right? And he shows us, this passage shows us, when you look at the way he talks, how easy he finds it to convince people. Okay. Now, one thing I suggest that you do is to annotate the passage before you actually start your answer. And when you're doing that, right, once you have placed your context, remember character, plot, theme, literary devices, right? Keep that in your head. Use that as your template. Okay, now I've done some annotation of my own. Let's look at it. Okay, now, how poor they are that have no patience. Right? He is, now remember, Rodrigo is angry. So, Iago, this is an exclamation, right, on Iago's part. So he's trying to calm down an angry Rodrigo, convince him that all is well, right? What wound did ever heal by degrees? Right? This is a rhetorical question, children, and you know that rhetorical questions are used, right, in order to convince people of something. Right? Rhetorical questions are questions you don't have an answer to, but they are very good at convincing people. Right? Thou knowest we work by wit and not by witchcraft. This is quite ironic because this is what, thanks to Iago, Brabantio has once accused Othello of. Yet again, another rhetorical question. Does it not go well? Right? You can see his eagerness. He's eager to convince Rodrigo that there is some purpose in him staying. Okay. And thou by that small hurt have cashiered Cassio. Right? Look at how close to each other look how similar those two words sound. Right? And it is a pun. And remember that Elizabethan audiences loved puns, right? And they got them just like that. Though other things grow fair against the sun, yet fruits that blossom first will first be ripe. Now, Iago has used the metaphor of gardening and of growing before when talking to Rodrigo. When he first tries to convince Rodrigo that Desdemona is not going to continue to love Othello for very long and that her appetite needs to be sated and that she will find someone else, he uses the metaphor of the garden. Okay, here he's using it again. Also, by the mast is morning, right? He suddenly realizes that it's morning, right? But by the mast is a swear word. And if you remember, the very first words that Iago utters in the play are swear words. What's the first word he utters? He says blood, right? Which is a shortened form for God's blood, right? And this is something that you see him do again and again. And finally, pleasure and action make the hours seem short. What does that show us about Iago? That he takes joy in his evil. Okay, that for him, the journey is as much fun as the end, as his destination. Okay, right. Let me just check the time. Let's get on to the next slide. Now, this is from the short story, Everyday Use by Alice Walker, right? But that was before we raised the money, the church and me, to send her to Augusta to school. She used to read to us without pity, forcing words, lies, other folks' habits, whole lives upon us too, sitting trapped and ignorant underneath her voice. She washed us in a river of make-believe, burned us with a lot of knowledge we didn't necessarily need to know, pressed us to her with the serious way she read, to shove us away at just that moment, like dimwits, we seemed about to understand. Okay, so obviously you have to mention the fact that Alice Walker was a Black American writer. Okay, now, how do we place this context? Right, this is obviously first person narration. The mother or mama, as she's called, right, is waiting for her daughter Dee, whom she hasn't seen for a while, right? And this is obviously a flashback, okay? A flashback to when Dee was a child or a young girl, and Dee was still living with her mother, okay? Now, if you look at this passage, you realize that the whole passage is based around Dee's education, right? And the effort it took to give her an education. So we raised the money, the church and me, right? It shows us, especially in the light of the way Dee behaves later, right? That Dee is obliged to that community, to her mother and to her church for her education, right? Let's also look at the purpose to which she puts that education. She used to read to us because this passage actually tells us a lot about Dee. And remember, at this point, we haven't still seen Dee, right? So this is the writer giving us an impression of Dee before we actually meet her, right? She used to read to us without pity, forcing words, lies, other folks' habits, whole lives upon us. So what Alice Walker is showing here is that in Dee's case, education has actually proved divisive, and that Dee has used her education, right, to basically shove her superiority in the face of her family. So let's look at the language that Alice Walker is employing in order to do this. Okay, so the church had me to send Augusta to school. I underline that to show that Dee is obliged to her community, is obliged to her mother, right, for her education. Let's look at the verbs that Alice Walker is using. Forcing, washed, burned, shoved, right? So the technique that she's actually using there is those verbs. Okay, and it gives us a picture of Dee as somebody who basically feels herself superior, right? And flaunts her superiority to her uneducated mother and sister, okay? Okay, so obviously this is a narrator's view. I've already said this. It's a narrator's view of D, and it's the use of flashback. While we realize that the community has helped to send D to college, we also realize that D has had advantages that her sister Maggie has not. Right? Okay, and let's look at the author's view of education here. Because here, education is seen as something that, as I said before, that is hugely divisive, right? And of course, right, when you're talking about the language, you need to look at what the underlying verbs have in common. Now, how do you relate this to the plot? The character, of course, here is D. We find out most about D in this passage. How do you relate it to the plot? Right? When D actually arrives, we are not really surprised by the way she treats her mother and sister. Okay, and of course, what is the theme here? Obviously, education. Because we see, not just here, but later on, what use D has made of that education. Okay. Right. Now, the poem I picked is from John Donne, right? I, like an usurped town, to another due, labor to admit you, but owe to no end. Reason your viceroy in me should defend, but is captived and proves weak or untrue. Right, now I told you that the poetry context is a little different. So you have to say that this is by John Donne, that he's a metaphysical poet, and that this is one of his holy sonnets. Okay, as you know, it's from Better My Heart, 3% God. Okay, now in this case, right, there is a biographical note that can prove useful, right? First, John Donne was a priest, okay, and two, he was a convert, right? He was born a Catholic, but because it was difficult to be a Catholic at that time, he became a Church of England. Okay, and many of his holy sonnets are imbued with this terrible sense of guilt. Okay, now I picked this particular verse because it's a lovely example of a metaphysical conceit, right? You know that a conceit is, and that it's a kind of an extended metaphor, but that a metaphysical conceit, right, compares two things that we usually wouldn't compare, right? Things that seem very dissimilar, right? But after we read the poem, we actually see the similarities. So to begin with, we don't see the similarity. We acknowledge that there are differences, right? But after we read it, we realize that there are similarities and that this is a good fit, right? Now he's comparing himself here to a usurped town, right? A town that has been taken by force, right? To another due, he's due to God, but he has been taken over by evil. Okay, so let's look at how this metaphor has been extended, because that is something you really need to talk about when you're doing a poetry context. You have to examine the language really, really closely. Okay, so I said it was an example of a metaphysical conceit. Let's look at the feeling it conveys. It conveys his sense of helplessness in the face of his sin, right? Because right through this poem, what really grabs you is how sinful he feels. Okay, and let's look at how he has extended that metaphor. Usurped town, right? Laboring to admit the rightful ruler, but reason your viceroy in me, right? You know, a viceroy is somebody who rules instead of the king, right? So he's basically saying my reason should be God's representative, but is captived and proves weak or untrue. And this actually helps to tie into the last three lines of the sonnet, right? Where he uses that metaphor of captivity, of imprisonment again. Okay, also look at the mood and tone, children, of this poem. Because one of the things about John Donne is that his poetry is that he is as passionate in his religious poetry, right, in his relationship to God, as he is in his relation to women in his love poetry, right? And what really comes across is his passion. Because if you look at the language he's using, captive, that he's weak and untrue, that he's a usurped town. Okay, so this particular passage that I have chosen, right, you really need to look very closely at the language. You really need to look at how the metaphysical conceit is worked out. And you really need to look at the feeling, right, behind the lines. Okay, let me just check the time. Okay, we have basically a lot more time to go. Because I think I miscalculated the time. I could have done a context on the novel as well. But I am open to questions. So let's use the next half an hour or so. If you have any questions on any context passage or any doubt you have regarding context questions. Dinali?
Thanks, Vi. There is one question, and I suppose I can invite students to ask more questions, particularly if they wanted to repeat something they have missed or something like that.
Sure.
So one question we have from Maria.
Yeah.
Do we have to use to write the theme as theme, or can we just give the just write through the answer? I'm not
through
very
the answer. Through the answer. You know, it's when you say, you know, the theme is this, the character is this, when you divide it up like that, right? I think it's better for you to keep that division in your head. Okay, rather than to say, you know, this is what we learn about the character, this is how it links to the plot, this is how, this is the theme, right? If you can actually word it most, I mean, if you're having difficulty expressing yourself, yes, then go ahead, right? But if you are a good writer, then I think a little bit of subtlety, a little bit of nuance will help you.
Okay, now the questions are coming in.
Okay.
Netmi asks, what is the name of the technique used to describe those verbs? And I think she's misspelled a word. I'm not sure. Netmi, would you like to retype that? We'll move on to the next one. Madam, when it comes to poetry, do we need to only focus on sound effects? Ask.
Not just sound effects, children. We just
Nazat.
a whole lot about, we just did a whole bit on imagery, right? And children, remember that because we think of imagery as, you know, metaphors, similes, synecdoche, personification, metonymy, sometimes we forget very simple things that writers use, like adjectives, like verbs. Okay, if you look at Better My Heart, 3% God, there are two sets of verbs there, right? One set, like shine, breathe, knock, shine, and seek to mend, right, are very, very gentle verbs. The second set of verbs, break, blow, burn, and make me new, right, are much more forceful verbs. And that is actually enhanced by the use of sound effects, by the use of that plosive alliteration on the B sound. Okay, so you actually have to do both. And you have to remember that literary effects can be as simple as, you know, changing the grammar around, or verbs or adjectives. Okay. It doesn't always have to be a technical thing, a technical word. Any more questions, Din?
Yes, there's a few more. There's a request for you to roughly explain among school children, believe it. You can think about that. if you like. But
It's a poem that ought not to be on your syllabus at all.
we will look at the more specific ones about context. Do we have, okay, Rasika, hi Rasika. Rasika is asking, do we have to mention the stanza from the particular text?
No, you don't.
See that.
Okay, yeah, especially when, things that are like if you have a sonnet or something. If say, for instance, this is line 9 and it's the Volta, okay, in a Petrarchan sonnet, yeah, then you can say, right, this is from the final sestet or whatever. But you don't really need to have to mention the stanzas at all. No one expects to remember that.
Right. Then I think Minoli asks, is it okay to separate the paragraphs like themes, techniques, etc.?
Yes, children. There is this whole thing, and I've heard it often that a context question needs to be written in one chunk, right? But that must be really awful for examiners, right? I don't like reading answers which have not been paragraphed. Yeah, you're just reading this big chunk and you're trying to work your way through it. I'd say paragraph. Use paragraphs.
Definitely use paragraphs.
Yeah, see, Dinali is agreeing. It's a nuisance otherwise.
Madam, there are some requests from to have a highly scored students answer as a model.
Yes, I can email one to you.
Okay, thank you very much,
I don't have one now. I don't have one. I mean, just off the top of my head, I need to look in my file. And yes, I should be able to locate one that has been written by an A student.
Thank you very much. And there's another question. When it comes to characters, can we speak about the characters in the poem or the speaker? I'm not also sure about the question.
What's that question? Like what? You mean you're talking about, say, something like Fisherman Mourned by His Wife, where he actually creates a character and she speaks. Is that what she means?
Maybe. It's a question from a student, really. That's what
so that it is the speaker is a fisherman's wife, right? And she is a character that Patrick Fernando has created, and he's speaking in her voice.
Right. There's a couple, lots more questions. We'll go through them quickly.
Yeah. No worries.
Do we have to mention all the themes or only the relevant theme?
Only the theme that you can see in the passage that you have been given. Okay, only the theme that you see in that passage, right? Say for instance, let's take Othello, right? And it's a passage that shows you that Othello is like fiercely jealous, right? There are so many other themes like race and deception and things like that that are completely irrelevant to that context. So it's only what is relevant to those lines.
Thank you, Bai. There's a question. I'm not exactly sure what it means, but I will read it anyway. Can you please explain the limitation when we are answering the quotation question?
Do you mean, does she mean the
word limit? I think so, yeah, because there's another question, a similar one. How many pages should we write a context answer for?
Yeah, well, from what I have heard, right, of the chief examiner, he kind of likes you to write about a page and a quarter.
Very specific.
But that's, that's kind of hearsay. And also I've had A kids, like kids who have got A grades, who write very concisely, right? And sometimes it's just three quarter of a page, but they've included everything. Right? But from what I've heard, a page and a quarter, but that's just hearsay.
Right, thank you. Then we have, do we have to quote from the given extract when answering the context?
Yeah, especially if you're talking about language, you do. Right? When you're talking about language and literary devices, say if you're talking about the verbs, you have to give the examples of the verbs.
Right.
Right? If it is an image, yes, then you need to quote from the text.
Right. And then we should not paraphrase, right, madam? Asks.
It's not necessary. No, it's not really necessary.
Right. And then Nuha asks how to include literary techniques in the answer. I think Ms. Vaidya answered that very well, Nuha. So this is already recorded and on YouTube. So I suggest you watch it again if you missed that bit. I don't think we should harass Vaidya to talk about what she has already talked about. Okay, do we need to include the background when we are writing a context in drama and short stories? Ask.
If it is relevant. Okay. By background, do you mean the author's background or the background to the times? Now, for instance, everyday use, right? It hinges on the fact that there was a movement in the 60s and 70s after the civil rights movement really got going, right? Because the history of slavery is just one of humiliation and misery, right? That Black people, thanks to the Black Pride, the Black Power movement, started going back to looking for an identity, looking for roots in Africa. Like, say, for instance, now Maya Angelou actually spent time in Ghana. Okay, and we see that in D, right? We see that in the way she has adopted what you call a Kikuyu name, the way she has, the kaftan she wears, the long dangly earrings, etc. Okay, so sometimes it is relevant if you get a context question that if the context is about how she has changed her name, okay, then of course that background becomes important, right? Sometimes a small biographical note can also help you. Say, for instance, if there's a passage about, Maggie, right? Maggie's burn, right? Remember that Alice Walker herself had a disfiguring injury, right? One of her brothers accidentally shot her in the eye and then made her say that it wasn't him, right? So, and she grew up feeling that she was disfigured, right? And you see some of that in the portrait of Maggie, right? So sometimes the author's background may be relevant, right? Sometimes the background to the work, like for instance, like in everyday use again, this 60s and 70s, looking to Africa for an identity.
Hi. There is a question from Sanuli. I think I can answer that if you want to raise your voice a bit, right?
No, I'm good.
Yeah, good. Okay.
Yeah,
how to include literary devices? Like, should we tell these are literary devices? I think this question comes from an early assumption that in the exam answer, you have to use the term literary devices. You don't have to.
No, you don't. You don't need. As long as you can identify the literary device that is being used, right? Is it a hyperbole? Is it a synecdoche? What is it, right?
Exactly. Then, can you all mute your mics, please? I can hear some conversations going on. Is there any specific number of techniques that we have to mention in order to get that 1 mark offered? Or can we just subtly write as many as we note while writing?
Just write as many as you can note while you're writing, because remember you have only 15 minutes for this, right? And it's 1 measly mark. But yes, as many as you can find, because you will find that some passages really don't have that many literary devices to speak of. And then you're very grateful that it's only 1 mark you're getting.
Right. Then the next one says, should we mention the impact of a particular literary device or technique in the context?
Yes, of course. Yeah, yes, definitely. Okay. Why is that effective? Okay. And this is especially true when you're talking about sound effects.
Is it okay to separate context with? No, you answered that. Sorry. Right. I think there's a question about impact of the particular. How should we mention the impact of a particular literary device or technique in a context? I think that also your answer.
Yeah, basically, what does it do? Why is that literary device there? What does it do? Okay, that metaphysical conceit, right? It is there to convey very passionately, right? His deep sense of guilt and his desire, right, to be close to God. Okay, and that it's a very powerful image, right, of a town being, being taken over by the enemy. So that literary device conveys that feeling extremely passionately. But you
Right.
have to comment on the use of the device, right? Why is it effective? Sometimes it may not be effective. There are a couple of poems where the literary devices are quite awful, right? That's also all right. You can say it.
Yeah. There's a very good technical question about answering. We usually begin the answer as these lines are extracted by blah, blah. Could you please tell me if it's okay to use this format in all our context answers, or should we use different formats?
Okay, it doesn't really matter. These lines are taken from, or this is extracted from, these lines have been extracted from, right? It doesn't really matter. Okay, or this passage is taken from. It doesn't really matter. I mean, don't knock yourself about it.
Madam, can you please explain about stream of consciousness that you can take or not?
Well, stream of consciousness is a way of narrating a story from inside a person's head, right? And how the way we think, right? The way we think is never linear, right? Sometimes a smell sets off a thought, or a word sets off a thought, or, a piece of music sets off a thought. So stream of consciousness is very often not linear. And it basically is a way of trying to narrate a story from inside somebody's head. So it will include all the jumps, the repetitions, the lack of links between thoughts. It will include all those things. If you try and think of it as trying to narrate a story from inside somebody's head, right, you kind of get it. Is that enough then?
I think so, yeah.
There's some very good online stuff on stream of consciousness, actually. Okay, Lit does a fairly good job on describing it, on explaining it.
Right. There's another question, Miss. Does that mean we should not emphasize words like theme, characteristics, and technique specifically?
Yeah, if you can avoid it, yes. If you can avoid it, but if you can't avoid it, use it. Right? I don't think it will make you a huge difference either way.
Can we explain the overall theme of the text in a context? I think this message came a bit earlier, and I think you have already answered that.
Yeah.
I'm going to go down because some of these messages have already been answered. Brief idea about there are lots of questions about other things in addition to context. I'm going to leave those out for the moment, children, because otherwise it's not very fair on Miss Vaidehi. Somebody wants to know how to contact Miss Vaidehi. You can see her email address right there on the slide.
You can email me, children. I kind of look at my email once every 3 days or so, but I will get back to you eventually.
Can we mention the repetitive tone in the poem, A Poetry Question from Batter My Heart?
The repetitive tone? How? What do you, I don't understand.
Yeah, can we mention repetitive tone in the Poetry Question from Batter My Heart? Yeah, it's not very clear. Yeah, there are lots of questions about how to study literature, how to progress towards getting an A, and your experience, etc. I think for those you can email Ms. Vaidehi.
Yeah, just email me.
How many pages should an answer be? I think 1 to 1.25. I think that is covered. Yeah, lots of questions.
Also, children, it's like really important to plan your answer before you do it, because now you get that extra 10 minutes now. You get an extra 10 minutes to read your paper, right? So once you very quickly decide which questions you're going to do, use those 10 minutes to actually map out at least a couple of answers.
And how much marks do examiners deduct just for a single mistake? I don't think
it depends on how big the mistake is, children. Say, for instance, you get the text wrong. That's a huge mistake. It depends entirely on the mistake.
There's a request from Devmi to describe a little more about metaphysical conceits. It could be the first time some students are hearing about metaphysical conceits, I think.
Okay, so
if you want to go back to that slide, right? No.
Now, that is a technical challenge for me.
Just
wait. Oh yeah, let me
see. You're technically quite advanced.
You can go to previous slide, ma'am. Previous slide.
Okay, previous slide.
Once again.
Again, yeah, that's the one. Okay, so children, when you're doing metaphysical poetry, one of the things that later critics found about, thought about metaphysical poetry is that it, I think there's one quote that says that it yokes ideas by violence together. Okay, and people found metaphysical poetry actually became far more popular in the 20th century than it was at the time that John Donne and Andrew Marvell and Henry Vaughan and George Herbert were writing. Okay.
Rasika, can we mute all their mics, please? I don't know how to do it from here.
Sure, ma'am, sure.
Thanks. Go on, Vaidehi, sorry about that.
Okay, no worries. So, metaphysical imagery is known for the fact Dinali?
Yeah?
Yes, ma'am.
You can hear me, right?
Yes, okay. Now we can hear you. Yes, fine.
Okay. So, the metaphysical poets, unlike the Elizabethans who were like more or less contemporaries, they chose very, very unusual metaphors, very, very unusual images. They didn't stick to like traditional imagery that was taken from nature or that was taken from the Greek myths, right? They remember that this was the Renaissance. There was a whole lot of new learning that was coming in, right? Astronomy, map making, what do you call, voyages to like strange far-flung places. Okay, and the metaphysicals actually made use of this, and you will find that they compared things that are very, very unlike each other, but they were able to make that connection, right? And they were able to make that connection sometimes in just a line, but sometimes, as in this case, extended over a whole quatrain, right? I think one of the easiest ways of understanding a metaphysical conceit is to look at John Donne's poem, A Valediction Forbidding Mourning. In the situation behind that is he's going on a journey, right? The journey by ship at that time was dangerous, and his wife is crying, right? She's very worried, she's unhappy, she's scared that he's going to die. And this is his effort to comfort her. In the last couple of verses, right, he compares himself and his wife to the twin legs of a compass, the compass that you use in geometry. Okay, now to Elizabethan poets, right? This would have been a really horrible image, completely unromantic. How do you compare two lovers to something as prosaic and dull as the two legs of a compass? But over the course of a couple of verses, right, he shows us why this is a perfect image, right? He says that his is a steady leg, right? Remember that the one leg of the compass has to stand steady and the other leg goes round, right? So he says his wife is the steady leg that stands in the middle. He is the one who's traveling, going around. And he says it is her steadiness that makes him end where he began. And all of a sudden, this unromantic compass image, right, becomes romantic and beautiful. Okay, that for me is still the best example of a metaphysical conceit. Really, is that clear enough?
That is very clear. And I think if students couldn't really catch it, they can rewatch the recording. This is recorded and being recorded, and it will be available on YouTube.
Okay.
Okay. Are there any other specific questions on context? There's a lot of questions about other things, about writing essays and length, etc. But anything specific about context?
Yes, the main thing you have to look at is why are these lines significant? Why have I been given these lines and not any other lines? Why are these lines significant? Right? I need to basically excavate these lines. Right? I need to look at them really carefully. I need to look at the language carefully. Why are these lines significant? If you can answer that question, you have answered that question thoroughly, then you've done a good job.
There's another interesting question. Do we have to conclude separately? I think, do we have to have a separate conclusion? Seems
not
to be
for context. No, not for context. There's not enough time. Right? If you have only 15 minutes, and remember that, like, you know, if when you practice context answers, sometimes you can get it down to 13 minutes. Then you can use those 2 minutes for your, you know, you can use those 2 minutes to prepare your long answers.
Right. Then there's a very good question. Should we insert the write the themes first and next techniques? Or is it okay if we mix the themes and techniques?
That's they actually have to be mixed, in that the technique has to correspond to what it is doing, right? So if that technique is being used to further express the theme, right, then you obviously tag it onto themes. But if the technique is being used to show us somebody's character, right, then you obviously have to tie it in with the character. The literary devices children will just go everywhere, right, wherever they are needed. Earlier, it was a much easier system. You just wrote the literary devices at the very end, right? That was a really easy system. This is much harder.
Are we allowed to criticize religion, like when writing regarding Batter My Heart? Is another question.
What is the criticism you have? This is one man's terrible sense of guilt and sin, and his desire to be good, right? His desire to be closer to God. And he feels that the only way he can do that is if God takes him by force. I can't really see what criticism of religion you can make there. I mean, if you can, just put it on chat and I'll think about it.
Yeah,
Remember,
I think
it's a very personal poem, right? It's an extremely personal poem.
I think we can take one more question and stop. Otherwise, we'll be running over time a lot. What exactly is the difference between a theme and an issue, or are they the same? Because they're always mentioned together. A very interesting question.
Yeah, central issues and themes, same thing, darling. There is no, Like if they ask what are the central issues involved, they're basically asking for theme, right? There is no real difference.
Yeah, there are requests for you to give some feedback. You can email them. And I think Ms. Rasika
Yeah.
has shared Ms. Vaidehi's email on the chat as well.
Okay. Yeah, email me. That's fine. If you have specific questions, just ask the question and I'll try my best to answer it. But please don't ask me for an explanation of among school children.
If we don't mention the era and the time period, will it reduce marks?
Well, you're only getting 1 mark to begin with, so you'll probably lose like half a mark. Right? You know, some examiners insist that it needs to be there. Some examiners don't care. I'd just put it in to be on the safe side.
Okay, I think that's it with questions directly related to context. If you like, there's another question about techniques. I think that might be interesting for everyone. What is the difference between a symbol and a motif?
A motif?
Yeah.
Okay. So, you know, a motif is a recurring pattern, right? It doesn't really need to represent anything else, right? Let me give you an example from a play that is not on your syllabus, right? Macbeth, who has killed his king and usurped the throne, right? Very often, the motif of clothing is used to describe him, right? Clothing that doesn't fit, clothing that is too tight, clothing that is too new, right? And that is just a motif that shows us that, you know, he has usurped a place that he had no right to, right? A symbol, children, always, a symbol requires a key actually to unlock it, right? Let me just give you a couple of examples. Now, we know that the dove is a symbol of peace, right? But if we did not have the key to that bit of knowledge, right? A dove would just be a white bird. Okay, a symbol is something that has to be unlocked, right? Like for instance, a wedding ring, right? A wedding ring is a symbol that you are married, right? But supposing you belong to some tribe, right, where there are no such things as wedding rings, right? It's just a pretty piece of jewelry. And this is especially true of religious symbols. Because, say for instance, the symbol of the cross. To a Christian, the cross means something, right? And that is fundamental to the Christian faith, right? Your belief that Jesus died on the cross for your sins, right? If you are a non-Christian, right, the symbol is a little different. It means that either somebody is a Christian or there's a church. Okay, now supposing you are, again, let's say a member of a tribe, right? Some remote tribe that has had absolutely no contact with the outside world, but there's suddenly a cross there, right? A cross is just two pieces of wood at right angles to each other, right? So for you to understand how a symbol works, you need to be able to unlock it. And the prime example actually is from animal crackers, right? If you look at the elephant, which is a symbol of the United National Party, right? Or you look at tigers, which is a symbol of the LTT, or you look at the lions, which are a symbol of the Sinhalese people, right? If somebody in the West who doesn't know anything about Sri Lanka reads that poem, he will need a key, right? He will need a key to understand what those symbols are for him to get anything out of the poem at all. Right? A motif doesn't require that. Dinali, are we good there?
We are perfect. Thank you very much. And I think we can, there's one more question. I think that's useful for everyone. Is it a must to mention the act and the scene number or in a context from Othello?
Nope, not necessary at all. Okay, of course, Act 3, Scene 3 stands by itself, right? And it's very easy to spot a context from Act 3, Scene 3. But no, you don't. You definitely don't need act and scene. And especially if you're not sure and you think you're making a mistake, please don't.
Right. Thank you, Vaidehi. I think.
No worries. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And thank you, students, for all your questions. I know we couldn't take them all, but because there were so many, we stuck to the ones that were directly relevant to this session. So over to you, Rasika.
I invite Mrs. Mithila Veerasinghe from Res Kurunagala to give the vote of thanks.
Right. Thank you, Rasika. Hope you can all hear me. So first of all, I would like to offer my sincere gratitude to Ms. Vaidehi that we've been very old friends, that you have always been helping the students of Northwestern Province every year. So thank you so much for your very clear session on, how to answer context questions. And it was so clear. And also the students came out with a lot of questions, and so thank you so much again for helping us. Rasika, do you have any the announcements for the students? You can take over.
Yes, only one thing. Tomorrow after the session, we'll drop one of the links for the feedback. Please kindly do that. It will be a great help. If you have any questions also, you can note down. Tomorrow the link will be shared for the feedback. It will be a Google Doc, so all can do it. And I must thank Madam Dinali Fernando also for helping us a lot, for doing a very interactive question answer session. And there had been a lot of questions. I think students can raise questions tomorrow as well. How do you feel, ma'am? Madam Dinali?
Yes, of course. Tomorrow we'll be looking at doing the unseen prose and poetry, and definitely it will be interactive.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you very much, Mrs. Vaidehi and Madam Dinali, for helping us. Yeah. And it is great to have you all with Chiaw Zonal English channel, and the things will be recorded and uploaded to YouTube. All can see that and hear, listen to whenever you want. And also tomorrow, let's meet for the third day. My special thanks to Madam Dinali, Madam Sashikala Asala, and Madam Vaidehi Pereira for the great contribution on behalf of students. Thank you very much, everyone. See you tomorrow. Good night.
Good night. Good night, everybody.